Every single one of these buildings is illegal under international law. From the centre of this community, you wouldn't know you're anywhere out of the ordinary. Shops, a school, kids playing, parents supervising. It's only when you see the perimeter that you grasp where you truly are. Har Bracha, an illegal Israeli settlement on what should be Palestinian territory in the West Bank. It's home to around 3,000 religious and right-wing Zionists, many of whom believe their very presence here fulfills an ancient religious prophecy.
I don't call it settling, I call it resettling. We're returning to where we were thousands of years ago.
These are the settlers of the West Bank. Quick disclaimer.
Hi, this is post-production me. I'm taking a quick break from editing and going on a walk, and I just wanted to add a quick note before we jump in. As a side note, this is also the first time I'm addressing all of the new viewers and subscribers on this channel, which is kind of crazy. The last time I was filming myself talking to a camera like this, very, very few people were watching my videos. So a big thank you to all of you for watching. Okay, so I've been thinking a lot about the ethics of publishing a video about the settlements in the West Bank. And I know some of you who were commenting on my last video weren't too happy that I was filming inside one. Just to put all my bias on the table, I am very opposed to the settlement of the West Bank. I'm not gonna pretend otherwise while putting content out like this. But I do also think it's important to try and understand the settlement project, especially if you're from somewhere like the US or parts of Europe or here in the UK, where it's very likely that your taxes have been used to fund those settlements and the occupation of the West Bank. I also think it's important, if you oppose the settlements, to know a little bit about how the settlers see themselves and the kind of arguments they use to justify their presence in the West Bank. Because then when you encounter those arguments out in the wild, you can counter them effectively. So that's my rationale behind making this video. I'm sure some of you might disagree with me, which is fair enough, but I just wanted to put this out there before going any further. So with that, back to the video.
In the occupied West Bank, Israel has announced a decision to seize 64,000 square meters of land.
Palestinians are facing threats from Israeli settlers who seek to push them out.
Allies of Israel condemned a sharp rise in attacks on Palestinian civilians in the West Bank.
You redeem the land, you bring Jewish families, and this will bring light instead of darkness.
As the world has been watching the genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza, Israeli settlers have taken advantage of the moment and increased their activity in the other separate Palestinian territory, the West Bank. Less than a year before the Israel-Gaza war began, I was on a 300-kilometer solo cycle journey through the West Bank, documenting the Israeli occupation of the region as I went. And I'd made it to Har Bracha to learn about the settlers and settlements for myself. At the foot of the hill below its entrance, Avraham, a settler who lived there, had come to meet me.
How's it going? Excellent.
I hope your Shabbat was good.
Over the next few days, I had a chance to interview some of the settlers who lived here. Since this was filmed, the 2023 October 7th attack and Israel-Gaza war has only increased support within Israel for settlers and settlements in the Palestinian territories. And the goal now of many settlers is to also establish similar settlements in the Gaza Strip. So, who are these people? Why are they here? And what drives their ideology?
There are two ways that Jewish people can live. We can live in exile dispersed among the nations, or we can live in our homeland, in a specific land that's ours. We're in a place that some people view shouldn't be part of Israel. There's a bit of conflict, a bit of discussion about where we live, the hilltop that we live on in Judea and Samaria, as some people would say the West Bank.
The names for this region are highly politicized. Right-wing Zionists who support the Israeli occupation of the region would usually call it by its biblical names, Judea and Samaria, or the Shomron, which both emphasize the Jewish connection to this land. On the other hand, those who support the withdrawal of Israeli forces and settlers, and are typically in favor of some form of Palestinian statehood, tend to use the term the West Bank, the Palestinian territories, or just Palestine. The West Bank is the internationally recognized name for this territory, but refers only to the area I was in, on the west bank of the Jordan River, as well as East Jerusalem. It doesn't include the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian territories, or occupied Palestinian territories, is also largely internationally recognized, but that also includes the Gaza Strip. And Palestine can either include the same or be used by those who are against the existence of Israel as a state to refer to all of Israel and Palestine. The UN, EU, USA, and the International Court of Justice all consider the West Bank to be occupied Palestinian territories. The sovereignty of the State of Palestine is recognized by 147 of the United Nations' 193 member states. Now, we'll come back to the interviews later. But first, a quick bit of history. Israeli settlers began moving to the West Bank after Israel captured it from Jordan in the 1967 Six-Day War, along with more territory from Egypt and Syria.
Israeli government officers announced the old city of Jerusalem is captured, as well as Bethlehem, the West Bank of the Jordan, and the drive into Syria stops just short of Damascus.
Almost 20 years prior to that, the First Arab-Israeli War had seen Israel gain its independence, but Jordan took control of the West Bank and expelled 17,000 Jews from the remaining Jewish communities there, part of a wider exodus of 850,000 Jews from the Muslim world in the following decades. 1 million Palestinians would also be driven out of Israel, in what Palestinians call al-Nakba and al-Naqsa. For some Israeli Jews, though, the 1967 victory gave them a chance to re-establish a presence in the West Bank. There, they built settlements, initially with very basic infrastructure, but over time, these grew into fully fledged towns. Some believed they were fulfilling Jewish prophecies by being here, returning to what they consider to be their holy land. These are the religious Zionists. Others moved because they opposed handing any of this territory back in a peace deal and had maximalist territorial ambitions, wanting to create what's known as Greater Israel. These are the revisionist Zionists. Of course, there is a fair bit of overlap between the two. There are some far more extreme settlers too.
Hello from the Holy Land! It would be a lot holier with the Arabs out.
Kahanists, who you've met in my video about the evolution of Zionism. Named after the extremist Rabbi Meir Kahane, who supported expelling all Palestinians from Israel and the occupied territories.
My answer, to transfer the Arabs out of this country.
By force?
Hopefully through compensation and their willingness to leave.
If compensation doesn't work and they're not willing?
Through force.
There's also groups of Messianic Zionists, who believe that the coming of the Jewish Messiah is imminent, and their presence in the West Bank is a prerequisite for the Messiah's arrival. Following that, they believe an ultra-religious Jewish theocratic state will be established. There are also radical extremists who don't fit neatly into one faction, aligning with a mix of Kahanism, Messianic Zionism, and ultra-nationalism. When you hear about settler violence, it's usually this group that's directly responsible. Now, the settlers who moved into the Sinai Peninsula were removed in a 1982 peace treaty with Egypt, and from the Gaza Strip in a 2005 disengagement plan. Today, 20,000 settlers remain on the Golan Heights, which Israel captured from Syria, a number that Israel would like to increase. And I have an entire video about the Golan Heights and the conflict between Israel and Syria on my channel. A quick note that in the occupation and settlement of the Golan Heights, while it did displace around 130,000 Syrians, here there is not the same level of day-to-day oppression and human rights abuses as those faced by Palestinians in the West Bank. Though the Golan settlements are still considered illegal under international law. But the vast majority of settlers are in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, where 700,000 Israeli settlers currently live, along with 3.3 million Palestinians. There are two kinds of settlements in the West Bank. Outposts are unauthorized settlements that are illegal even under Israeli law, as well as international law. Since they're not officially recognized by Israel, they only have basic infrastructure and are often made up of trailers and mobile homes. They tend to be home to the most ideologically extreme settlers, the Kahanists and Messianic Zionists I mentioned earlier. There are 224 of them in the West Bank, and they're usually quite small. In total, they house 20,000 settlers. Then there are settlements like Har Bracha, which are illegal under international law but are recognized by the Israeli state and so are legal under Israeli law. These tend to be much larger. There are 141 of them in the West Bank and East Jerusalem that are home to 700,000 settlers. In the pro-settler right wing of Israeli politics, these two groups represent two sides of the same coin. You can think of revisionist and religious Zionists as the mainstream establishment, while Kahanists and Messianic Zionists form what Israel tries to present as the radical extreme fringe. There is plenty of overlap though, and while each group may deny it, and may even occasionally disavow the other, they ultimately enable one another. The establishment provides legitimacy, funding, and state protection for settlers. The radicals drive the expansion of the settlement project on the ground, and often violently push Palestinians off the land. The more extreme settlers blur the lines between civilian and paramilitary.
Get into the car, now!
Okay.
Get into the car, now! Leave it!
Next time we won't be nice. This is my house. Don't care if this is your house. This is my house.
Okay.
This is my house. I was given it by God.
Shame, shame.
In some cases, they effectively operate with the protection of Israeli soldiers. Here is a good example.
4 Jewish settlers, 2 armed with M16 assault rifles, another with a pistol, are flanked by a small group of Israeli army soldiers.
Moments later in this video, a settler shoots one of the Palestinians. Outpost or settlement, establishment or radical, what all the Israeli communities in the West Bank have in common is that they violate the 4th Geneva Convention, which states that the occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territories it occupies. In 2004, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion that declared the West Bank settlements to be illegal. Har Bracha was established in 1983. Like many other settlements, it was developed from a demilitarized Israeli army base. Today, most of its 3,000 residents are the establishment, revisionist, and religious Zionists. The settlements themselves have helped shape how Israel's occupation of the West Bank is structured. The Oslo Accords were a series of peace agreements between Israel and Palestine that were signed in 1993.
Once the agreement will be implemented, no longer will the Palestinians reside under our domination.
Peace has no borders.
And they divided the West Bank into 3 administrative areas. Area C is the largest, under the full control of Israel, and makes up 60% of the West Bank. Area B is under mixed Israeli military and Palestinian civil control, making up 22% of the Palestinian territory. The remaining Area A is under full Palestinian civil and security control, making up just 18% of the region. The Oslo Accords were meant to pave the way for a phased handover of areas B and C to the Palestinians. That would have involved removing the settlements and settlers, as was done in Sinai and the Gaza Strip. But that never happened. The Oslo Accords would collapse, and the Israeli military remains in areas B and C, as do the settlers. As for who's to blame, on the Palestinian side, fundamentalist groups like Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad opposed the Oslo Accords and wanted to destroy Israel as a state, carrying out attacks on civilians to undermine the peace process.
Attacks on Israelis are increasing. The government's trying to make peace with a very fragile majority.
On the Israeli side, ultra-nationalist Israeli extremists also carried out attacks.
In the West Bank town of Hebron, a U.S.-born Israeli settler named Baruch Goldstein opens fire in a crowded mosque.
Today, after the attack, Israeli militants hailed him as a hero.
What was also familiar was his political outlook. He was very critical of the peace process. His hero and good friend was the late Rabbi Meir Kahane.
And even assassinated the prime minister who signed the accords.
The assassination today of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, gunned down at a pro-government rally tonight in Tel Aviv. A young Israeli student linked to a right-wing Israeli extremist group was arrested at the scene.
But there were also powerful elements within the Israeli government who supported the settler movement, opposed Palestinian statehood, and actively worked to undermine Oslo from within. Here is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself, in a leaked recording from 2001 at a meeting with a group of settlers, boasting about how he sabotaged the Oslo Accords. The settlements were a key part of that strategy, and Israeli settlers continued to move into the West Bank despite the Oslo Accords, as part of Israel's long-term plan to change the so-called facts on the ground. Establish and expand more settlements, and it is a lot harder for anybody to remove the settlers that live there. That creates an incentive for Israel to hinder peace talks as much as possible, until those facts on the ground favour them so much that they no longer even need to consider Palestinian statehood. Netanyahu has vowed never to dismantle the settlements, so the settlements and outposts have only increased in number and population since then. The outposts, illegal even under Israeli law, can be found in both areas C and B, but not Area A. Sometimes those outposts get recognised as official settlements, allowing them to get more funding, develop better infrastructure, receive more protection from the military, and further entrench Israel's control of the West Bank. In some cases, part of a settlement may be officially recognised, while other parts of it are not.
So, over here, this is an Israeli settlement over here, but it's expanding onto here as well, so you can see more temporary looking accommodation over there.
Official settlements, on the other hand, are all located in Area C. This has fragmented the Palestinian-administered areas A and B in such a way that Israelis can now travel across the West Bank, north to south, east to west, without passing through a single Palestinian area.
this road is under Israeli authority here, but this road, that's controlled by Palestinian authorities.
While Israelis are restricted from entering the Palestinian-controlled areas, for Palestinians, the list of restrictions is long. The entire system is designed to protect the settlers. While Israelis in the West Bank live under Israeli civil law with full civil rights, Palestinians here live under martial law and are denied basic freedoms and rights. This is why most human rights organisations consider the occupation of the West Bank to be an apartheid system of racial segregation. In the last episode, Avraham showed me around Har Bracha on, of all things, a unicycle, while I followed him on my bike.
That's the 36er. And this is the 26-inch, and I just got a new tire for it. I ride it off-road.
It was weirdly casual given the reality of our surroundings. But looking back on it now, it says a lot about how normalised this system is. I was surprised at the level of infrastructure here. Apart from the fortifications, the buildings looked like those you'd find anywhere else. Schools, a kindergarten, a doctor's office, and shops. I suppose I wasn't expecting it to seem so established.
Cool. Two stores here. One is a clothing store, and one is a food store.
Okay.
But I shouldn't have been surprised. Between 2004 and 2023, Israel spent the equivalent of $6.5 billion on the settlements. The amount has steadily risen over time. In 2023 alone, it was over $500 million. And this investment has created a new dynamic. Now, the settlements attract some people who are not all that ideological. Instead, they come for economic reasons. Tax breaks, cheap land, subsidized mortgages, and even business incentives. That alone shows how valuable the settlements are to the Israeli state. And as a result of these policies, because Israel is such a huge recipient of foreign aid, foreign funding, whether through governments or non-profit groups and charities, often ends up both directly and indirectly supporting the settlement project.
We're going to this side. We're not in the UK anymore.
Settlements like Har Bracha are almost always built on hilltops. You can spot them easily from a mile away. They have a clear vantage point over the surrounding area, making them very defensible in case of attacks.
This is the place where security guards can stand in these concrete kind of trenches and look out over the Palestinian areas behind me.
But the hilltops are symbolic too, and reflect the power dynamic here, as the settlements on top of them overlook Palestinian communities in the valleys below. We stopped at a viewpoint overlooking Nablus, the third largest Palestinian city in the West Bank.
What we see down here is the refugee camp known as Balata, adjacent to the city of Nablus. Up on the mountain in the distance, that's the community of Elon Mored, Jewish community. There are communities along the hilltops of Nablus.
Oh yeah.
When our community was founded in the 1980s, the residents of the town would go down into Nablus, would buy in the markets there, buy fruits, buy vegetables. Ever since the first Intifada, it's become unsafe for Israelis to go there. Very unsafe.
The first and second Intifada were two Palestinian uprisings against Israel. The first began in 1987. Over 1,000 Palestinians were killed, as were over 100 Israelis.
Today, the Israelis say they shot dead 2 more demonstrators, bringing the number of deaths to 16.
The second began in 2000 and was far deadlier, marked by many more suicide bombings. 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis were killed. It ended when Israel withdrew its forces and settlers from the Gaza Strip. Now you'll notice the numbers of casualties in both intifadas were heavily skewed towards the Palestinians. But still, this is one of the factors that shaped Abraham's ideology, because he and his wife were caught in the violence directly.
I don't know if you want to hear it on camera or off camera, but Naomi and I were victims of a terror attack in Jerusalem at the very beginning of the Second Intifada. In fact, we may be the first Israeli victims of the Second Intifada. And that was in Jerusalem. And we were hospitalized as a result. My rocks were thrown at the vehicle that we were in. And I lost consciousness because one hit me in the face and broke my nose. So I don't remember really anything until getting to the hospital and waking up and getting a CAT scan. They broke my wife's arm. After I was unconscious, they threw me out of the vehicle, threw me on the ground. Fortunately, I got out of there alive. We left our car behind. It was just subsequently burnt with all of our possessions in it for the holiday. It was difficult.
For Abraham, this is deeply personal. Now, I'm not here to say how someone should process an experience like that, but it doesn't change the fact that Har Bracha sits on occupied land, or that settling the West Bank contributes to an expansionist system of domination over millions of Palestinians.
I don't see any difference between Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or Samaria. As far as I'm concerned, this is all the land of Israel.
We pedalled a little further on to the edge of Area C, the zone under total Israeli control.
And so from these yellow gates, this like in between section here, you can head up and down.
Not really. I feel like I can't go very much further. Israeli security control is basically until here.
Yeah.
And it's just about here.
Okay.
We'd been as far as Abraham could safely go, so we pedalled back to Har Bracha, where I'd have the chance to wander around on my own, as Israeli military jets roared overhead. The perimeter of the settlement is surrounded by CCTV cameras, barbed wire, and lookout spots. Armed guards patrol the edges. Some are Israeli military. Just a few of the approximately 7,000 to 10,000 soldiers stationed here when I was cycling the West Bank at the end of 2022. Since then, that number has now increased to between 10 and 20,000. Others are private security.
It's dangerous around here?
Yeah. Here, yeah.
Do you always have this with you?
Always.
Always.
This is armor. Look. That's armor.
So this window here is super thick. Okay, so this is a very thick armored door, and every bus apparently has one. Is this for rocks?
Not shooting.
Oh, for shooting?
Not shooting, yeah.
Wow, okay.
It's not work, the shooting not coming.
Yeah.
just outside the entrance to the settlement, a row of cars. Nothing stands out at first, but look closer and these have Palestinian number plates.
Now, to some, they might be considered traitors, but for hundreds of Palestinian men, the need to feed their families has to come first. Their terrible deed, building illegal Israeli settlements.
Har Bracha employs some Palestinian workers. In the West Bank, before the Israel-Gaza war, around 40,000 Palestinians were employed in Israeli settlements. Now, the most charitable explanation here is the one I was given by some of the settlers.
We, in this community, actually employ Palestinian Arabs from neighboring communities that are working in the building. We're providing them jobs, good-paying jobs, so that they can come home and feed their families. I want my neighbors to be happy. I don't want them to be motivated to do terror against us. There's no reason why I should try to motivate them, and I don't think that being here is a problem. I don't think I'm taking away anything from them. The opposite is true.
But there is an unspoken other side to this too, because it also creates an economic dependency on these settlements, while the Palestinian economy is stifled by the occupation, and allows Israeli employers to pay Palestinians lower wages than they would pay Israelis. Most construction work in the West Bank is inside these settlements, so for Palestinian labourers, there often isn't much choice. The cars, of course, are not allowed inside, and the workers themselves have all passed rigorous background checks to get a permit to work here. The criteria to pass are often arbitrary and unpredictable, so permit access serves as another method of control. I met many Palestinians on this journey who were uncomfortable sharing their thoughts about the occupation on camera because they feared reprisals from Israeli authorities, especially permit denials for work or crossing into Israel. As evening drew in, the call to prayer from the surrounding Palestinian towns echoed through the valleys below. To justify their presence in the West Bank, a lot of settlers turned to ancient history.
I don't call it settling, I call it resettling. We're returning to where we were thousands of years ago. It's about contributing to the land and building the land and fulfilling in what we view as a fulfillment of prophecies that are thousands of years old. Returning to this land is something that's written in our holy books in the Bible, and we see it happening before our eyes.
Settlers see their connection to Israel and the West Bank going back over 2,000 years. They view even the name Palestine as an attempt by the Romans to erase the Jewish connection to this land, which, before the Roman conquest, was called Judea, and themselves as descendants of the Jews that were exiled from Jerusalem by the Romans. Now, this is a view shared by a lot of Jews, but while for many it may remain a spiritual and cultural connection, the settlers translate this into a political one.
It's our homeland, and we were 2,000 years in exile, and the Romans that expel us wanted to cancel our connection to this land, and that's why they import the name Palestina from the Philistines, the biblical Philistines, to cancel our connection to this land. And now we return to our land. Like the prophecies written in the Bible, that we will return.
It is true that some historians view this renaming as a deliberate erasure of the Jewish connection to the land by the Romans, but others argue it was more of a bureaucratic change. Either way, the name stuck. Now, when it comes to the religious relevance of the region, the passage that most religious Zionists turn to is this one. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said, "To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates." This they view as a promise from God that Israel, Palestine, and in some cases much of the surrounding region, should belong to the Jewish people. And the prophecy mentioned is long and complicated, and interpretations vary. But a brief summary is that the Jews will return to the land they were exiled from over 2,000 years ago, first by a Babylonian king, and then by the Romans. There, they will build the land and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem, which was destroyed twice, once during each of those expulsions. After this third temple is complete, the Jewish Messiah will arrive, and the end times will be ushered in.
When that's complete, is that the redemption?
Well, part of the redemption is a fixing of the whole entire world. Okay? And that involves also building the temple in Jerusalem, on Temple Mount. Now, that's a whole different story, because you're saying, oh, there's a big mosque there, it's a holy site for Muslims. I want this to be a house of prayer, as Isaiah says. My house is a house of prayer for all nations. Do we need to go physically build it today? No, but in 100 years' time, when I'm no longer, will there be a temple in Jerusalem? I sure hope so. Will it happen next year? Will it happen tomorrow? Looks like it's kind of difficult, right? We're not going to build it. We're not going to destroy the mosques that are up there.
Now remember, Avraham represents the more moderate and mainstream of the settlers' positions. Al-Aqsa is the mosque in Jerusalem. It's the third holiest site for Muslims, and is built on Judaism's holiest site, Temple Mount. More on that in the next episode. But though they're in the minority, within those messianic extremes of the settler movement that I mentioned earlier, there are some who support removing the mosque and replacing it with the third temple, an act that would likely trigger even more catastrophic violence. Regardless of their views on the mosque, for all religious Jews, as well as Muslims, the site holds huge significance.
As religious Jews, we pray 3 times a day. And in our prayers, we face in one direction. We can be in Africa, South America, Australia. We face towards Israel. When we're in Israel, we face towards Jerusalem. And we're in Jerusalem, we face towards the place of the Holy Temple. Our prayers are filled with mentioning Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple, rebuilding of the land, and gathering of the exiles from the 4 corners of the earth. We say that every day.
But biblical prophecies and ancient history do not determine modern international law.
I know that under international law, like the international community regards, say, Har Bracha as an illegal settlement, right?
I don't know.
But
someone will have to tell me that. Someone who's an expert in international law will have to explain to me that.
But at least internationally, you've got recognized like the West Bank and Israel. Why is the current arrangement to you not enough?
Well, looking at first of all, the Bible and our holy books, we understand that the land of Israel was promised to Abraham and his descendants. But even more recently, there was what's called the Balfour Declaration over 100 years ago. The Balfour Declaration essentially said that there's going to be a Jewish homeland that's formed in the land that was the British Mandatory Palestine.
The 1917 Balfour Declaration came from colonial Britain and proclaimed support for, quote, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The British hoped this would increase support in Jewish communities, particularly in the US, for the Allies during World War I. But true to form, the British were playing some shady political games, because around the same time was the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, in which the British also promised Arab independence across a large part of this region. The wording was intentionally vague on Palestine. In return, the Arabs would stage an uprising against an enemy of the Allies, the Ottoman Empire. The British also hoped that this would increase support for the Allies in Muslim communities, particularly in what was then the British Raj, or British India. So they simultaneously made 2 conflicting promises, and the Arabs followed through on their side of the bargain, staging the Arab revolt against the Ottomans. And here is where things start to fall apart, because the British were also creating a third, secret agreement with France and Russia, in which the countries planned to carve up much of this region for themselves after World War I. This was the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement. Ultimately, after the Allied victory in World War I, the League of Nations was formed. And unsurprisingly, the idea they came up with, the mandate system, most closely resembled the Sykes-Picot Agreement, giving France control of parts of Turkey, Kurdistan, Syria and Lebanon, while Britain was given control of southern Iraq, Palestine and Transjordan. But this system did also incorporate support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. For the Arabs, this was a deep betrayal. Now, there's a lot more on this in my video about the evolution of Zionism. But eventually, after years of unrest, the United Nations would attempt to partition mandatory Palestine into a Palestinian Arab state and a Jewish one.
The map shows what partition means. The Jewish state colored light, the Arab state dark, Jaffa to go to the Arabs, Jerusalem internationalized.
This move sparked a civil war, which would become the 1948 First Arab-Israeli War, in which Israel would capture more territory than was allocated to it in the first place by this partition. But still, some settlers believe the Balfour Declaration should have entitled them to even more land.
The mandate was all the promised land, the two banks of the Jordan, the west one and the east one, all of it was mandate to establish the Jewish state. And they tore it and gave most of the area to Jordan and left for us just the West Bank, and then tore it again and gave us just even not the green line, but less than that.
Putting aside very fair criticisms of the validity of a promise from a colonial power, in an effort to manage the conflicting British agreements, Britain specifically excluded Transjordan from the area set aside for the Jewish homeland in 1922. This would eventually give rise to the modern state of Jordan. The right-wing revisionist Zionists at the time were furious, and today you'll still hear this argument in some of the pro-settler Israeli right-wing. But often omitted by those making this argument is a stipulation in the Balfour Declaration that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. And there were many of those communities here. Among supporters of this brand of Zionism, there was a saying, "A land without a people for a people without a land." It paints a picture of an empty space where Israel and Palestine now sit, devoid of civilization, waiting for inhabitants to arrive. In fact, on several occasions, I had settlers showing me old photos of Palestine, attempting to prove how empty it was.
I have an interesting picture that I want to show you also.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, you want me to bring it out?
Sure.
This is the building on the top of Mount Gerizim. What do you see in between here and here? Where are all the villages? Why is it important? Because it really shows that we're not talking about a nation that was here living in the land together as Palestinians. That didn't exist.
But this isn't accurate either. It may have been relatively sparsely populated, but there were people here. In 1860, over 400,000 people lived in what is now Israel and Palestine. Mostly Arab Muslims, but there were small Christian and Jewish populations too. This plays into a widespread argument in pro-settler discourse, casting doubt on the legitimacy of the Palestinian identity.
I view that there is a Palestinian identity. I view that it's not an ancient identity. Okay, it's not an ancient people.
Does that make it?
This picture illustrates it. Does that make their struggle less legitimate?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, for them to say that the uninhabited land here in Har Bracha is theirs because they had a country here, that's ridiculous.
But it is normal for identities to be forged and strengthened in times of conflict and suffering. And just because an identity is young doesn't make it any less valid. All identities were young at one point, the modern Israeli one still is. So yes, Palestinians calling themselves specifically Palestinians may be relatively recent, but it is actually older than most settlers would like to think, and predates the modern state of Israel. Palestinian Arabs began developing a distinct identity around 200 years ago, and Arabs in Palestine began calling themselves Palestinian before World War I.
And now we have 500,000 Israelis living in Judea and Samaria, in communities in eastern Jerusalem, which I think is a move in the right direction. We're not preventing anyone from having a state. We're not taking anyone's state away from them. This land that we're building on was empty land before this house was built, before this community was built. There are no Arabs that were living here that were chased away from their houses to build this community.
In a purely literal sense, specifically in Har Bracha's case, some of that is true. The hilltop itself that Har Bracha was built on was empty. But this ignores some very important context. There certainly are many parts of the West Bank and East Jerusalem where homes have been taken away from Palestinians. And even in cases where they're not, in practice, the Israeli settlements make a contiguous Palestinian state impossible. With the religious and colonial justifications for the settlers being here, there are only a couple I heard that referenced more modern security concerns.
This specific hilltop is important to us historically and strategically. We understand that without this land, Israel has a harder time defending itself against next time any of our neighbors may want to attack us. There's an importance for us being here on this hilltop.
The reason people like Avraham see it that way is geography. The West Bank is the high ground. Were one of Israel's adversaries to take control of the mountains here, they would have a big military advantage over Israel. On top of that, this is Israel at its narrowest point. Just 9 miles of flat land from the border with the West Bank to the sea, making it easy for an army to split the country in two. In this vulnerable lowland region by the sea lies 70% of Israel's population and 80% of its industry.
We're here in the West Bank to provide that strategic depth so that we can defend ourselves, so that we're not in this very skinny state very close to the sea.
Regardless of religion and of promises made by foreign colonial powers, this is why the illegal Israeli settlement of Palestinian land has been allowed to continue. Not only under the current extreme far-right Israeli government, but also under so-called left-wing ones in the past. The settlers see themselves as a line of defense or offense in a potential future war with Israel's Arab neighbors. Despite the decades-long military occupation of the West Bank, all the suffering it has caused, and the human rights violations in the process of upholding an apartheid system, Israel is unlikely to withdraw its forces or the settlers from the West Bank anytime soon. In fact, quite the opposite. Settler activity is increasing with the support of the government, and may eventually pave the way for full Israeli annexation of the West Bank. All this because Israel sees the strategic depth that control of the West Bank gives the country as essential to its survival, at the expense of Palestinian statehood and freedoms.
The situation as things stand now puts Palestinians in a situation where the Israeli military is in control in a lot of places, but they, because they're not Israeli citizens and they can't vote and stuff, they don't have any real say over their future or self-determination. Even the Palestinian Authority, you could make the argument that it exists as long as the Israeli forces are okay with them, because they're in little pockets in different places.
Look, what I'm looking forward to is a situation where we don't have terror activities against Israel. I think that once that happens, once people realize that what has started with the first Intifada in the 1980s has not accomplished those goals of bringing to Palestinian statehood, and someone turns off that terror switch and says, this isn't the way to go. And for the Palestinian Authority to take an iron hand against terror and say, we are working towards peace with Israel at all costs. I think that they'll see that will be reciprocated.
That is very hard to believe, even if it's what some of the more moderate settlers want. All you have to do is listen to what Israeli politicians have said over the years to hear all the pro-annexation and ethnic cleansing rhetoric. Now, there's a tendency among settlers to unfairly label all acts of Palestinian resistance as terrorism, all while Israel's violent extremists barely get mentioned. And we'll come back to that shortly. But from what I heard from settlers, it sounded a lot like they felt the Palestinians should just conform to the occupation. Basically, sit there and take it.
So what then, other than just like kind of going along with things as they are, should the Palestinians do? Like, what kind of concessions would you be willing for the Israeli side to make? Or do you think that the Palestinians should just accept the situation as it is?
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's a good question. And like I said, I don't view myself as a politician, and I don't feel like I have to have solutions for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I think that I do have to explain what motivates me to live here, and why I think that the land of Israel belongs to the people of Israel, and why Israel has a right to exist, not only in its small borders, but also in its larger borders. But I don't believe that I need to have a solution to this problem, this conflict.
It's easy to say that when your home is protected by soldiers and your community is expanding. Palestinians do not have that same luxury. And this attitude among settlers shifts responsibility and accountability away from them.
Is there any part of you that can empathise with or understand some parts of the anger Palestinians
Yes,
feel?
Entirely. In other words, I see sometimes lines at checkpoint, not very often, but occasionally I'll get to a point where I'll see a long line at a checkpoint, and I say to myself, that's unfortunate, because there are people there that just want to get to their job, just like I want to get to my job, right? That person should direct the frustration towards those people that are committing terror, and because those are the reasons for the checkpoints. Very unfortunate, okay? But this is something they brought upon themselves by bringing terrorists as leaders to form the Palestinian Authority.
Compared with what I'd seen on the way here, and what I have seen since filming this, the settler perspective seemed upside down. The blame for the oppression on the oppressed, and ignored an entire half of the equation. It is true that there have been many attacks by Palestinian groups against Israelis, but as we've already established, plenty on the Israeli side also undermined the peace process, from violent ultranationalist terrorists to right-wing politicians. And if you actually dig into the data, you'll find some pretty lopsided numbers. Now, the figures you're about to see are prior to the Israel-Gaza war. As Israel's relentless destruction of the Gaza Strip continues, at least 60,000 Palestinians have reportedly been killed. Almost 60% are women, children, and the elderly. But that is likely an undercount. Human rights groups, legal bodies, and genocide scholars have all called it a genocide.
This crime must stop immediately. Israel is committing genocide in Gaza.
The 1,200 victims of the October 7th attack in Israel are also not included in these counts. In the 13 years prior to the war, there were 139 Israelis killed in the West Bank and 2,294 injured. Those numbers rise to over 300 and more than 6,000 respectively if you include all of Israel and Palestine. Now, of course, that's not insignificant, but in the same time frame, more than 1,000 Palestinians were killed and over 90,000 injured in the West Bank. And that increases to over 6,000 killed and more than 150,000 injured in all of Israel and Palestine. In the West Bank, 71% of the smaller number of Israelis killed were civilians, while the same is true for 97% of the higher number of Palestinians killed. On top of that, there are currently almost 10,000 Palestinians in Israeli prisons. 3,500 of them are being held without charge or trial. 1 million Palestinians have been detained since 1967. 20% of the Palestinian population. Those numbers speak for themselves. But then came the final justification I'd hear for the settlers' presence here. The one that I, as a secular Jew myself, found the most painful to hear.
We became accustomed to living without a homeland. We continued living in our own communities, sometimes called ghettos, alongside non-Jews, dispersed really to all different parts of the world. But we had constant reminders that we didn't really belong. They came in the form of crusades and pogroms against Jews. And the peak of that was the Holocaust 80 years ago. I understand that the Jewish people have the ability today to live in another way, not spread out among the nations, but unified in one place, in their homeland, and that's Israel.
For the many Jews who do not support this ideology, the fact that the historical persecution of their ancestors is used to justify an occupation that has subjugated millions of Palestinians, well, a Jewish filmmaker called Jonathan Glazer put it well.
Right now we stand here as men who refute their Jewishness and the Holocaust being hijacked by an occupation which has led to conflict for so many innocent people. Whether the victims of October the 7th in Israel or the ongoing attack on Gaza.
I've always assumed that for most other Jews, the generational trauma of the Holocaust would make them more sympathetic to oppressed and displaced people than others. That's how my relationship with my Jewish heritage has shaped my worldview. But it's not the case for everybody.
The whole concept of refugees that exists in the Palestinian Authority, someone can transfer his refugee status to his children, and from his children to his grandchildren. So we have people that are fifth-generation refugees living here in what we saw refugees camps adjacent to Nablus. If the refugees die out, then you have one bargaining chip less against Israel. Rather than making people's lives easier, changing their status to regular citizens, there are refugees all over the Arab world, in Lebanon and Syria, the Palestinian refugees, in order to make this problem worse and to put pressure on Israel. Whereas these refugees could have easily been taken out as changed out of refugee status. I mean, my grandparents, they were real refugees. What happened was they were taken into concentration camps. They survived a war. They returned to their houses, and their houses were taken over by their neighbors. They were actual, real refugees. And what did they do? Did they complain about it? No. They managed to emigrate to another country, to restart their lives, to start from nothing, to raise their children, to give them education, and to raise families. And this is what I expect of people that are displaced as a result of a conflict, that they should be given by their authorities that are competent ability to change their situation from refugee status to say, okay, now I can move on, now I can go somewhere else. Whereas the interest in the Palestinian side is, let's use these people as a bargaining chip. Let's try to put pressure on Israel as much as possible by making sure that there are more refugees and that refugee status is passed on from generation to generation.
Avraham is right that there are generations of Palestinians who have grown up and lived in refugee camps in the Palestinian territories and other countries surrounding Israel. But I think he forgets that there's a big difference between them and the survivors of the Holocaust, who received international support after the defeat of Nazi Germany. While Jews, after all their suffering, had a new place to go, Palestinian refugees are trapped in limbo. It is fair to point out that countries like Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt have all, at times, restricted the rights of Palestinian refugees, while, at the same time, using the refugee issue as political leverage. But it is Israel that's responsible for the displacement of those refugees in the first place. And that's continuing to deny them the right of return, also a violation of international law. When it comes to naturalizing Palestinian refugees, there's a strong argument that this would put at risk their right of return. And it would be an acceptance that they're never going home. Instead of sympathizing with the displaced Palestinians, the way the generational trauma of the Holocaust seems to have manifested here is in the constant fear of attempted annihilation again. Now that fear is directed towards the Palestinians and surrounding Arab countries. Again, concern about further persecution and even genocide is widespread in Jewish communities as a whole. But the settlers and the Israeli right wing weaponize that to justify the oppression of the Palestinians.
They hate us. They want to kill us. It's not about culture, it's even not national fight. It's religious. They will not accept us as Jews. For this reason also, we can't allow them autonomy.
They is a conveniently broad word. Vague statements like this allow settlers to frame all Palestinians as murderers and terrorists. But Palestine is not a monolith. Just like Israel, Palestine has its extremists. And nobody should be surprised that an occupation fuels further radicalization. Suggesting this is all about religion also misrepresents the conflict. There is a long history of secular Palestinian nationalism and secular Palestinian resistance groups. I suspect the ultra-religious among the settlers see it this way because religion is the primary driving force of their ideology. It's also important to note that while some Palestinian attacks, like the suicide bombings of the Second Intifada or October 7th, are undeniable war crimes, Palestinian resistance that targets military targets, so long as it falls within the rules of war, is considered legitimate under international law. For many of the settlers, though, any act of Palestinian resistance equates to terrorism. Now, I won't pretend that there aren't plenty of people in Palestine and the surrounding Arab countries who would like Israel gone. And there is widespread anti-Semitism in those regions. It's fair to say that fundamentalist groups like Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad have had genocidal intentions. October 7th reignited fears of those intentions within Israel and many Jewish communities. But as Israel's military is committing an actual genocide in Gaza now, there is far more genocidal rhetoric coming from Israeli leaders and Israeli media.
כל ילד בעזה הוא האויב. אנחנו צריכים לכבוש את עזה וליישבה ושלא יישאר שם ילד עזתי אחד. אין ניצחון אחר.
And while there's plenty of talk of Palestinian attacks on Israelis in my conversations with settlers, there was never any mention of the settler attacks against Palestinians. There were over 1,200 incidents of settler violence in 2023, but less than 3% of settlers who engage in violence are convicted of a crime. This leads to a sense of impunity, where settlers, even when engaged in violence, are protected by soldiers. Behind this violence are extremist settler groups, like the Kahanist Hilltop Youth. These groups call the attacks price tags, an attempt to justify the violence as retribution against anyone limiting the settlers' activities. In reality, it's just an excuse for thuggery, violence, and racism. One of the worst examples is from 2015, when a Palestinian family, including their 18-month-old child, were killed in an arson attack. At the trial for the attackers outside the court, a group of Kahanist settlers taunted the grandfather of that child, with a chant so sickening I won't say it out loud. This kind of extremism isn't as far from the levers of power as you would hope. As of 2024, Israel's Minister for National Security is Itamar Ben-Gvir. This man, the person responsible for quote-unquote security in the West Bank, is an extremist settler himself, a Kahanist who's been convicted of supporting an extremist Zionist terrorist organization, Kach, which was established by Meir Kahane, the man I mentioned earlier. The group and its offshoots were responsible for numerous terror attacks against Palestinians and left-wing Israelis. He has supported deporting Palestinians from Israel and the occupied territories, pushed for giving Israeli soldiers and police immunity from prosecution, and advocated for the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip. The Minister of Finance is also a settler extremist, somewhere between a religious Zionist and a Kahanist. Bezalel Smotrich has proudly called himself a fascist homophobe, and has repeatedly called for Israel to annex the West Bank. Both of these men are from the more extreme Israeli outposts, not settlements. So the supposed radical settler fringe is on the fringe no longer. It has worked its way well into the establishment and now controls some of the most powerful positions in government. And with their loyal party members in the Knesset, Israeli parliament, where Netanyahu's coalition holds a razor-thin majority, they essentially have veto power over the government's policies. There is a final piece to this puzzle. Beyond the boundaries of the settlement, on a neighbouring hilltop, sits a camp of volunteers, unlikely allies of the Israeli settlers. All the volunteers here are Christian Zionists. Many evangelical, some non-denominational. And they're here to help the settlers however they can.
People that come, it's because they've read their Bible and they see that what's happened here, that this is the mountains of Samaria and vineyards have been planted, as was prophesied. So people want to come and see it and take part in that, and also a desire generally just to bless the Jewish people in what they're doing. We believe they're here fulfilling prophecy and doing what God's called them to do, and yeah, we kind of really feel that we should be alongside and encouraging them in that and supporting them, which is not what Christianity has done historically. So.
They're viewed with a certain amount of suspicion. The settlers are well aware that some Christian Zionists might have ulterior motives, and are wary of people trying to convert anyone to Christianity. So the volunteers are kept separate from the residents of Har Bracha. Here, they help out on Har Bracha's vineyard. Their social media posts are a weird mix of upbeat videos that present the volunteering as a kind of fun, spiritual camp activity, and other clips showcasing the military equipment they've provided to settlers. Body armor, thermal drones, and helmets. Volunteer non-profits like this one are another source of indirect taxpayer funding from abroad. Organisations set up in other countries that receive donations. They're often tax exempt, and donations made to them by individuals are tax deductible. Hundreds of millions of dollars have flowed to Israeli settlements this way, through an organised network of Christian Zionist groups. Evangelical Christians give around $200 million a year to Israel. You see, the largest group of Zionists, by far, are actually Christian Zionists. Christian Zionism comes mostly out of evangelical and Pentecostal churches. Now, in Jewish communities, Zionism is politically diverse. Within it, you'll find liberals who support a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli one. And you'll also find hardliners who advocate for full Israeli annexation of Palestinian land and support settlers, and extremists who support ethnically cleansing the Palestinian territories. But Christian Zionism tends to be far more uniform. It's highly religious, deeply supportive of the settlements, and rooted in end times prophecies. This isn't just a fringe belief either. Not only are there powerful Christian Zionist lobbyist groups, but some people who hold these views occupy incredibly powerful positions, particularly in the United States, where Republican administrations have embraced this worldview.
Ultra-conservative Christians now serving in key roles under President Trump.
There are around 15 million Jews worldwide, and that includes non-Zionist, post-Zionist, and anti-Zionist Jews. But in the US alone, there are an estimated 20 to 50 million Christian Zionists. Donald Trump's administration has had Christian Zionists front and center.
I happen to be one of the 25 evangelical advisors to the president. All of the accomplishments in the last 3.5 years in Israel have come from the evangelical base in America.
Mike Pence, his former vice president.
Donald Trump and I stand with Israel because Israel's fight is our fight, because Israel's cause is our cause.
Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State and CIA Director.
It fills me with unending pride to know that American hands helped build the modern house of Israel.
Pete Hegseth, the current Secretary of Defense.
That Zionism and Americanism are the front lines of Western civilization and freedom in our world today.
Mike Huckabee, the current US Ambassador to Israel.
There is no such thing as a West Bank. It's Judea and Samaria.
They all share a theological belief that supporting Israel, especially Greater Israel, is part of a divine plan to fulfill a biblical prophecy, the second coming of Christ.
We're living in the generation of the rebirth of the nation of Israel. In order for all of the other end-time prophecies to happen, Israel has to be at home in her own land.
By that, they mean Greater Israel, not Israel's recognized borders. So think about this for a second. There are people at the highest levels of US government, shaping foreign policy, military aid, and America's position on the settlements and the Palestinians. Basing this approach not on international law or human rights, but on apocalyptic Christian theology. And with this powerful backing and such an extreme Israeli government in power, there's very little now holding the pro-settler Israeli right wing back. Har Bracha is just one of many illegal Israeli settlements. This story can be found over and over again across the West Bank. The settlement's development has been fueled by a combination of right-wing Israeli nationalism, unfortunate geography, a warped response to generational trauma, perceived historical ties to the land, and deep religious beliefs. And when everything else has been debated and discussed, how do you argue with someone who can fall back on the belief that they are fulfilling religious prophecy? When someone thinks God is on their side, everything else is secondary. Settler activity is only increasing, facilitated by the most extreme far-right government in Israel's history, while the media's attention is focused on the genocide in Gaza. And it wouldn't be possible without the support of foreign governments, NGOs, and charities. To be honest, I was left with a feeling that has stuck with me until now, even when I read some of the comments on my videos. That we're constantly being told, don't believe what you're seeing. Don't believe what Israeli leaders are saying in their own words. Don't believe what you hear from all the human rights groups and academics that condemn the war in Gaza as a genocide and the occupation of the West Bank as apartheid. Don't believe what I've seen for myself on the ground in the West Bank. It is, frankly, exasperating. So I left Har Bracha and wouldn't be stopping in a settlement again. Over the next few weeks, I'd cycle to the Palestinian cities of Ramallah, Bethlehem, Hebron, and Jericho, where I'd see how increasing Israeli settler activity really impacts Palestinians.